Welcome to Let's Talk. Today we're going to talk about spray paint, and there's a few different brands you can use. First, we're going to talk about primers, which is, if you don't already know, primer is the first thing you want to do to a model. It helps the paint stick to the model, um, and basically gives it proper texture so that the paint will stick. Because most models are smooth plastic or pewter or resin, and paint will just slide off over time or come off, chip off on your hands and fingers and all that stuff. So that's no good. So let's talk about primers. There's two main brands I'll use. My first and favorite brand is Citadel. They make a really good primer. It has a fantastic finish. It's not very chalky. Actually, it's not chalky at all, and it doesn't obscure any kind of detail on the model, which a lot of primers tend to expand to cover the model or whatever you're priming, whereas Citadel paints kind of have a shrink wrap effect so that it doesn't obscure any of the detail. It is pricey though. On average, it's about $17 to $20 a can, and the colors are even more expensive. The best thing I can say about the Citadel brand as a whole is that their colors are true match, meaning that their sprays match with the same name, whatever their paint pot is, which is difficult to do because of the nature of how to make something into a spray can. So a lot of companies can't achieve that. Army Painter has a few, and it's really not that hard with black and white, which is the common colors for priming. But yeah, so it's a true match. It has the great finish to it, and it adheres to the model really well and doesn't obscure any details. So that's Citadel paint's my first choice. If I'm not going to do Citadel paint or it's unavailable, I'll do the Privateer Press paint, the Formula P3. These are pretty dang good. Sorry, that's my dog making noise. These are pretty good. They don't have as smooth of a finish as Citadel, but they're not as chalky as something like a Krylon that you would get at a Home Depot or other utility store. So it has a pretty good finish. It's not overly expensive. It's about $12 to $13 a can on average. And so, yeah, that's my second choice if I can't get Citadel paint, or if I just don't want to shell out that money because I'm painting, let's say, a large model where I don't care if a little of the detail gets obscured. So something like a Titan or whatever, I would probably use Privateer Press paint just because it's cheaper. Krylon. Now, why wouldn't I just go to the store like Home Depot, Lowe's, Ace, whatever, and just buy Krylon for $8 a can? It is a primer for painting things like houses or furniture or whatever. Now, that means that it's a good primer. Okay, paint will stick to it. However, it can tend to be really chalky, which can really affect the quality of your model. Since your models are so small, those tiny little chalky beads on it are really noticeable. And on top of that, it expands to cover, and it's an acetone base. So that tends to obscure a lot of the details on a plastic model just because the acetone does degrade it a little bit, and on top of that, the nature of the paint is it wants to expand and cover as much area as possible, so it tends to obscure finer details like crevices in armor, or sometimes eye sockets get obscured, or nostrils, or armor slits, track lighting, all those little things. If you're painting fantasy style models, you might end up turning chainmail into full plate, just because it can fill in all those little beads and everything like that. But as far as terrain goes, Krylon is probably your better bet just because it's cheaper, and if your mountainside is a little chalky, I mean, nobody cares, right? And it's not the end of the world because you don't need to do fine detail. So if you want to prime terrain, ruins, buildings, things like that, it's probably a pretty good bet. Runs about $8 a can. So moving on, talking about color, I prefer to just use Citadel brand for colors. They are pretty pricey. I think they're about $20 to $22 a can. It is an all-in-one primer. So what that means is that if you know this is the color you want, you don't even have to do a black or a white primer. You can just skip straight to the color part, and any other paint over the top will work fine. Now, why Citadel, even though it's so expensive, is because it's true match, like I said, meaning this color, Xandri Dust, for example, is the exact same color as the paint pot. So later, if I'm doing fine detail work and I mess up, I can go back, get a paint pot of this, and paint over my mistake, and it'll blend really well. I don't have to worry about it. So that's what makes them so fantastic, is because if you mess up, you can go back and fix it like that. Now, Army Painter, I haven't really used their spray paints, but from what I understand, they have a few colors that have a true match like that, and they'll let you know if it does. But for the most part, it's pretty hard to do to get that exact match where you just can't tell any difference between the two. What will normally end up happening is the spray can will be a little chalkier, so it's a little lighter in color just because of that acetone base. And so what that means is when you go back and paint over it to paint over a mistake, you'll be able to tell the paint on the brush paint will have a much smoother finish and it'll really stand out. Now, if you're going to plan on washing the model with a dark shade or whatever, then maybe you can get away with that because the wash will help buff it out and you won't see as much of a difference. And the last thing is hard coats. So Krylon does make a hard coat. It's a clear coat. You can get a matte or gloss finish, and it's about $8. Now, those are great, whether you want to do matte or gloss. The problem with them is that over time, because of light damage, UV rays and everything does damage paint, it can start to yellow, and that could ruin your paint job. Now, if you painted your whole army yellow, like some Eldar models or whatever, then yeah, no big deal. Totally go for the cheaper option. That's great. But if you're painting anything else, over time you kind of get that yellowy hue. Maybe your Ultramarines start looking green, maybe your Trollbloods start looking a little brown. So I would recommend the Citadel paint. They make a really nice purity seal. It's a matte finish. So the problem with matte is that it's not as thick of a coating, it's not as protecting, so you may have to, in a few years, apply another coat, which is no big deal to preserve your awesome paint job, I'm sure. So I think it's about $20 a can, purity seal from Citadel Paints. Pretty amazing. And that's what I use to finish all my models. And it has a matte finish, like I said. So if your models tend to look a little glossy after the shade work with any kind of paint washes and you like that effect, do not use a matte finish because it'll totally ruin it. You want to look for something that's more of a gloss or satin finish. Or you can just do hard coats by hand. Citadel Paint still does make hard coat in a paint pot, and you can paint it by hand if you want to try and avoid getting rid of any sort of shine effects that you might have. You'll have a lot better control over it. However, it is by hand, so it does take a long time. I think that's pretty much it as far as spray paints go. And I think that's it for my videos for today. So if you have any questions, comments, concerns, you can direct them to the comments. If there's anything you want to see me cover in the future, by all means go ahead. I plan on doing a few videos about paint techniques and highlighting, shading, things like that, and talking a little bit about coming up with a good color scheme and, color dynamics and how to do a color wheel and things like that. We'll probably talk more about modeling later on and other things. So just leave any questions you have in the comments, questions, concerns, directions to any websites. If you just need help on a technique or anything like that, by all means feel free to ask either myself or I'm sure somebody else could help answer your questions. Other than that, have a good one.